Hi, and welcome to another episode of Unblinded, a clinical trial podcast. I am Manny Vazquez, Senior Director of Clinical Data Strategy here at Veeva, and I am joined today by two really great guests. I'm really happy to have with me Leianne Ebert from Alcon and John Acampado, colleague of mine from Veeva. So I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves for those who may not know who you are. So Leianne, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. So my name is Leianne Ebert. I'm the head of data operations for Alcon.
So I'm, as Manny said, John Acampado. I am the Senior Director of Clinical Strategy for Veeva MedTech. Coming over from the industry, I've been a Veeva customer longer than I've been a Veevan. So very happy to be on this side of the fence now. And I focus primarily just on medical device and diagnostic companies within Veeva.
Cool. Well, it's great to have you both. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, I have a bag. I brought a prop. John, when did we first meet?
Oh, that's not the yearbook, is it?
So John and I met at Summit, I think it was 2022
Yeah.
in Boston. And through a series of back and forth conversation of where are you from? I'm from San Diego, but I'm originally from New Jersey. Oh, I'm from New Jersey. What part of New Jersey? I'm from Bridgewater.
Did y'all go to the same
I'm
place?
also from Bridgewater. Don't get ahead of me now. So a little bit of math. This probably went on for a solid 2-3 minutes, and the other people in the room were just going back and forth. And I said,
You found this
"You might have been."
undusted.
And so, John, I brought
Oh my
It's
gosh.
the yearbook.
our high school yearbook,
Class of 2000. I was class
And-
of 2000.
I think we need to read some of these
And-
notes at the front.
and here it is. There it is, right there. Somewhere back here. Yeah, there we go. There's me as a senior, right there.
Haven't changed a bit.
No. I thought this would be a great time to ask you, John, if you wouldn't mind.
Sign your yearbook?
Would you sign my yearbook
I would be fine.
with my Viva pen, please?
Yeah.
Oh, that is so funny.
I did not expect.
I had a great summer, by the way.
Yeah.
That's what they all say. Have a great summer, keep in touch.
Your handwriting hasn't changed either.
No, not since high school.
Best of luck in the future, from the future, your friend, John.
That's so funny. But y'all didn't know each other.
No, so
No?
Manny was the senior while I was a freshman.
Oh.
Yeah.
John's going to be a guest on the podcast. I have to do this. And so the one thing that I made sure I did not forget before we took the ride down here, because we're in Baltimore for SCDM, I said I set the yearbook aside well in advance. Anyway, thank you for entertaining me there, John, and thank you for signing my yearbook. And it's been great to be a colleague of yours for the last couple of years and have the shared history. So, Leianne, let's get into it. So we're here to talk a little bit about medtech specifically, maybe some of the differences that go on within medtech and device trials, and that side of the pharma business as opposed to what we might be more familiar with in biologics and things like that. So for anyone who's not familiar with Alcon, I'm sure a lot of us are, but what trials are you primarily focused on? Like what's the medtech that what's your niche?
Yeah, so Alcon does both device and pharma. So from a device perspective, we do like contact lenses, intraocular lenses. We also make all the hardware equipment that assists the surgeons in actually performing the surgeries. Lots of other stuff. That's just kind of the start. And then we also are in the pharma, so we span both sides of the gamut, and we have to deliver to both paradigms really effectively, and I would say in fairly similar styles and timelines and things like that, even though they both follow different regulations.
Okay, so speaking of regulations, why don't we go into that? Because that's probably something that people maybe who are not familiar with medtech and device trials, what are some of the regulation differences? And I'll just kind of throw it out to both of you, because John, I know you have some history here as well, and you probably have a lot of these discussions with people around the regulation. So what are some specific regulation differences that you could call out between what someone might deal with a drug versus a device?
Yeah, and jump in as you see fit, Leanne. I mean, the biggest difference that I've seen, so I worked previously in pharma as well before coming over to the device and diagnostic world. The biggest difference is that the regulatory pathways are definitely more unique in device and diagnostics. So unlike the typical phase 1, 2, and 3 that you experience in the drug world, we have different stages. So you can do first in human feasibility. We have pivotal studies. Obviously, we have post market as well. So that is going to vary in terms of the stages relative to your typical phases. The other thing that I'll call out as well is that from a submission standpoint, there are what we call 510Ks. You also have pre-market approvals and then also de novo applications. 510Ks, it really depends on type of information you're collecting, but that really is going to be dependent on the type of device to make sure that you basically are showing that that device that you are seeking approval for is proving the same effectiveness and safety as something else that's already on the market. Pre-market approval for, say, something that's more critical for health, maybe a new pacemaker or something else. Those might require pre-market approval. So a little bit different types of regulatory pathways relative to what I've seen in the past for pharmaceuticals.
The only thing I would add to there is just say a device, the regulation pathway can sometimes be a little bit faster. So because the requirements are a little bit different, pharma tends to take a lot longer. And I guess in a very practical terms, things that you see different is like, let's take like on a study in devices, we capture device deficiencies in addition to adverse events. You don't really see that as much in pharma unless you're getting like a combo device pharma product now, there's more of those on the horizon. So that's a very practical difference. Like in our case, we're actually a lot of times doing surgeries. And so we're looking at how the device is implanted and different things like that. Whereas like pharma, you're monitoring the drug over the long haul of different dosing based on whatever the requirements for that are.
Yeah. And if I can add, so I mean, the other thing maybe to think about, especially for devices, is it really runs the full spectrum of a device can be a tongue depressor all the way to a pacemaker, right? It could be elastic gloves all the way to a stent, right? So we really run the full spectrum of literally anything that you can either add to your body or be surgically added to make sure that hopefully have a better way of living.
And the analogy I'll give in eyes, and I kind of already said it a little bit, is we do contact lenses that you place on the eye, and we have intraocular lenses that you actually place in the eye. So there's a fundamental difference of placing it on and taking it off versus it's in and it requires some type of surgical removal if you were to take it out.
Okay, so what's an example of device deficiency versus you mentioned it kind of equated to adverse events, fever, fatigue, things like that that people might capture as an adverse event. Is there a common device deficiency?
A big difference. A big difference is an AE is on a patient after they've been consented. A device deficiency can actually occur before it ever reaches a patient. So it can happen actually more at like a site level when the product comes to the site and they notice something's wrong with it before it's ever intended for a patient to be implanted or what have you.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference in my mind. In the way you handle the device deficiency, there might be different categories that you would use based on the therapeutic area, but still the fundamentals of what we capture would be, I think, similar across therapeutic areas.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, when we first spoke last week coming into this, one of the really interesting things you both mentioned was the, I guess, lack thereof standards, and that with SDTM and things that we are familiar with on the pharma side as the standard of submission in the US, that's not necessarily the case when it comes to medtech and device trials. That's true? So how does standards work on that side, if it works at all?
Want to go first?
Sure. I mean, yeah, SDTM is not required on the device side. I think it's encouraged, but it's not a requirement. And so we do really work to follow still SDTM standards across the board. And we leverage a lot from pharma, but we still keep it focused on what's needed for the analytical requirements. In our case, we still very much standardize and enforce standards across the entire continuum of the business, whether it's med device or pharma, but we just don't have to necessarily submit an SDTM standards for a device. That's the biggest difference for us.
Yeah, I'd have to definitely agree, especially from a So there's CEDAR, there's CBER, and then there's CDRH, right? So CEDAR and CBER both enforce the submission of data in a certain format. CDRH, it is recommended, as Leianne said. So relative to CEDAR, CBER, CEDAR and CBER, CDRH does not require the submission of data in SDTM. It is heavily recommended, and they will accept it in SDTM format, but I believe they'll also accept it in a CSV file or a PDF or a TXT. Maybe not TXT, but they will accept them in just about whatever format you can generate. There are a lot of efforts underway to try to standardize things a bit more. There is an SDTM implementation guide specific to medical device. There isn't one, however, for diagnostics, but we are working with the FDA right now, or at least a working group that I'm a part of, along with a really large group of diagnostic manufacturers to figure out if that's something that we can standardize across those companies.
So the way that I would add to that is just to say, obviously, we prioritize pharma because it's required. Sure. You can't submit without it. And then we're progressively working towards the device side so that we're prepared as and when that becomes a requirement. So it just gives us a little bit more flexibility there to not have to meet the perfection standard that's requirement in that
Yeah.
regard.
Right now in device and diagnostic, it feels very 2010-ish. We're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. When is some sort of announcement going to be made? When are things going to be enforced? Who knows when? But I think there is a lot of need and interest to make sure that things are standardized. Because so one, we can do things more efficiently. But I mean, the whole idea of like, hey, everyone wants to do AI, right? How can we actually establish good artificial intelligence without a foundation of clean, usable, interoperable data?
Oh boy, that's a separate conversation because I mean, we just did some research at Veeva that's not, not MedTech specific, but it was just for, rank and file data managers, CRAs to just find out how are they working and people that are working on like phase 3 studies that have a good volume of data, find out how are they working, what's inefficient for them. And it's like, it's not good, right? I mean, it confirms a lot of what I think we suspected anyway, but a very, very high percentage of them, like in the 90s percentage of them, report back that they're doing a lot of their work outside of the clinical systems that they're meant to be doing it in. And they're all referencing Excel and all that,
We
especially.
in this pathway for a second.
Yeah.
You're hitting on a little bit of a point that I would say I'm fairly passionate about. I was actually talking about this coming over. In fact, you and I were talking about this. Yeah. I think one of the things that we have to be very vigilant about as organizations, both as our tech partners, but also as like sponsor organizations or CROs for that matter, is, we go through these quote unquote 2-year kind of projects or plans or big idea rollouts. And you're seeing this with AI a lot too. And the reality is that it doesn't all get implemented and embedded and like a well-oiled machine often in those 2 years. And if you abandon the follow through at 2 years because the money's dried up, the project's done, a lot of times you don't actually see these systemically embedded in the organization. This is a change management issue in my mind.
Mhm.
I think when we go through, hey, we need to, let's do something simplistic, change EDC companies from this company to this, right? Or whatever big change in it, we need to implement AI. It's more than just getting the money and getting the MVP or the system released. It's actually releasing it and then enforcing the users to go through the change
Mhm.
and ensure that that's well embedded within the organization and ensure that people are systemically adopting it in a consistent way. So, with what you were just describing there, we should be pulling data and seeing, are they actually using the system or not? You can see that through a lot of, I mean, I'll speak for the Viva systems. We can pull a lot of different reports out of Viva and understand, are people actually using the system the way that they're supposed to or not? And we do that to make sure that they are in Viva using, I mean, we purchased the Viva system for a reason, right? Because it creates a workflow and they need to be in there working and not resorting back to their old legacy habits. And I think that's an aspect of change management too, because if they're resorting to their old legacy habits, why? Is it because we didn't build the system well, or we didn't listen to a requirement that's really important for them to do the job? Or is it just because they kind of like their old habits and we need to put a little bit of pressure there to get them to change the ways they're working and get into this new flow?
Or was it just a training issue, right? Maybe it's something else around it in terms of the process, the governance around that. And we had a lot of stuff, especially if we think about governance and standards. There's only so much that we can enforce, but people still have to want to embrace it as well. But our support is needed.
Well, and I think the change management part is, I think it's easier said than done. And I think that we have to be careful to say, because we asked you to join this webinar or because we sent you this email, you should miraculously know how to do it.
Yeah.
I think we have to be more customer focused, and we really have to find more effective ways to really help them absorb it, because we haven't walked a mile in their shoes necessarily and know what their day job is and or what particular priority they have, where them listening to that webinar or reading that email is not top of their mind. Or if they even paid attention to it, do they remember how to apply that when they finally come to the moment that they need to utilize it? So I think more intentionality around this, and I think using a lot of the data within the system to tell you if they're using it is really helpful.
Yeah. And I do think that's especially impactful for what we do in device and diagnostics. So you and I have had discussions about this for the past several years. Coming over from pharma into device and diagnostics, I've always been a little surprised at how, not necessarily lagging, right? The industry as a whole, but it's not as dynamic as where I would expect it to be in terms of technology adoption, some of the change management aspects that you and I have chatted about, Leanne. It very much reminds me of how I think pharma was several years ago in terms of like new technology being I don't want to say injected, but infused into our systems. So there is a lot of that I think the medtech industry as a whole right now, there's an undercurrent of change that is happening because of the fact that there was that big jump from paper to electronic. And then now folks are really trying to figure out how to work in this really new digital world. And then there are these demands about AI, but we haven't really fully grasped how to really operationalize what we're actually doing with this new paradigm that we have from a digital point of view.
And so there's a couple things. For one, I think Alcon is actually further along than most in the sense that you have provided a tool. Whether or not people are using it the way you intended them to use it or the way they should be using it is another thing to tackle. But I think a lot of the folks that responded to this survey, which we did in partnership with SCDM, we cast a wide net because we wanted to make sure we just got feedback from anywhere, and they just don't have a tool to do it in. That's just, they're still following the process that they've always followed. So there was, I think, which stood out to me was, I agree with you. It's a leadership call to action to say we need to provide better tools to people to be able to do these things. But when we're in an environment like this where all the discussion is on AI and what's coming 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. We had a keynote yesterday that was talking about quantum computing and all the crazy things that is coming along. And we want people to be able to start wrapping their head around the idea of working alongside an agent, as a coworker. But they're so many of them are still just doing a lot of their work in things like Excel. Just seemed to me that like the aspirations of where we want to go are in stark contrast to the reality that we are currently in, and it's a wide gap to span. So I thought that was really interesting, and yeah, this was a deep rabbit hole, but I'm glad we went down it.
And I think it's fun to talk about kind of the futuristic things,
Mhm.
but I think we have to be vigilant about implementing our systems and our change efforts well. And I think when we put a business case together and we say we need this amount of money and this is what it's going to return to the business, and we put some objective measures to that, we have a responsibility as leaders to come back to the organization and show that that has occurred. And part of that means we have responsibility as leaders to follow it along that continuum and help that get embedded and ensure that we see that successful outcome on the end, and that becomes kind of the new status quo, or the new norm within the business. And a lot of times I think after you've kind of gone through getting approval to spend the money, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and we don't come back to that. And I do think at the end of the day, that's a disservice to our patients. We have a responsibility to steward that well. And part of stewarding that well is actually delivering on what we said we were going to do.
Yeah, 100%. And we've had internal conversations about this too, is when we do put a feature out that's meant to move things forward, that's meant to change behavior and allow people to do things in a better way, we still allow the option, right? Like there's still a export to Excel option in CDB. And so the question comes up with us sometimes, like, should we just make the decision for you? Should we just say, you can't do that anymore?
I don't know. Leanne has heard it from me plenty of times. As a former customer, I always liked the option. But then it does go into that question of like, are we doing a disservice to ourselves, like you were saying? Like by giving them an out, more often than not, people take the out. But then I'm always mindful about the teams I've been on in the past. I've transitioned groups from paper to EDC. The first EDC system that I feel really old saying this now. The first EDC system I ever worked on was we imaged laptops and then we would send the laptops out to the sites. And then the sites would actually have to send us the data back via 56K. So it's one of those things where I'm like, knowing where we've come as an industry, I don't know. It's rock and hard place, I guess.
What I would say is it'd be more interesting for me to be able to extract the data to know if people are doing that and who's doing it.
Yeah.
We extract the Excels and then we machine it in the background to do organizational level summaries of how our studies are flowing, because CDB doesn't aggregate across the studies in terms of seeing that demonstrated. So we still find a utility for that, even though I would absolutely expect our teams are not downloading those Excels into the actual review there. So I think there is a benefit to it because, like for instance, I don't want to go and look at every single study and see his review ongoing. I want to look for the entire organization. Where do we have opportunity to maybe lean in and help make sure that things are going more smooth?
The industry as a whole, specifically medical device and diagnostics, we are yearning for artificial intelligence, better machine learning. The industry also, I think, is a little bit different than what at least I've seen in the past, maybe with biopharma. The budgets are a little bit different. The revenue is a little bit different. I always make a running joke that in device and diagnostics, relative to what I used to do in pharma, we have deep pockets but short arms, and so there is always a need for more creativity, and then just as importantly, more efficient ways of doing things. And so while there is an appetite, I don't think that there is the appropriate foundation right now in medical device and diagnostics to actually take advantage of what's in front of us. But the nice thing is, it is right in front of us for everything that we can take advantage of as far as AI.
What do you mean by deep pockets and short arms in med device?
We,
Elaborate on that.
we don't want to spend money.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you have money, don't want to spend money, which is a difference between like just don't have money to.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I have a lot of thoughts on the AI framework. So first of all, I don't think there's a ton of platforms out there that allow us to integrate AI into the everyday normal business flow well. And so I think if the way we look to adopt AI, with the exception of a few use cases, which we can go down if we want, if we have invested into a system or a platform to do our work, to do our normal business process flow, then from my perspective, the AI needs to just naturally be embedded into that to where the end user really doesn't even necessarily realize that AI is playing a part, that AI just enhances how they do their work. You naturally get the benefits of that. So where I think we are going wrong is that we've invested all of this time and money and energy in these platforms like Veeva, but we're asking people to go outside of Veeva to use AI to then come back into Veeva to do the workflow. I think what's going to happen is people are going to stop using the functionality that we are investing in these data and document platforms for. And I think there's a tremendous utility there that we would be losing. I generally think that maybe with some limited use cases, which by all means, my mind can be convinced otherwise, we should be looking to embed AI into the natural, seamless workflow of how people are already using, or we should be looking for platforms that revolutionize that, in which that would be covered alongside with. So that's kind of where I stand with it. I don't know that taking people and losing the functionality that we've already invested in makes sense. I think you'd have to have a really strong business case there. And then I think the change management and adoption would be much harder. I think you'd have to be really careful with that.
We've chatted about this. AI is a tool, right? It's not going to replace anything, or it'll replace some things, but it's not going to replace everything. And just like any other tool, we have to be able to know how to use it. That still is going to be based upon a foundation of actually knowing how to do our jobs. Like data management, we still have to collect the data. We still have to aggregate other pieces of data. We still have to know how to clean the data. We still have to get it ready for analysis. That part is still going to remain. We just have to find ways to be more efficient doing it, hopefully with that tool.
If we're not utilizing the platform system fully and ensuring our people are working within it, then the likelihood that the quality in of the data is going to give us the quality out is much lower. So if we don't ensure that these things get embedded and that, I mean, from a clinical data perspective, it should be a little bit easier because we do really ensure a high degree of quality and integrity of the data, as we move towards lock and analysis and submission. I think sometimes with the documents, because historically they are more content driven, the checks on that have maybe not been as systemic. And I do think AI will increase this and allow for that to be better, but I think you're still going to want to be in the platform and the system using it to its maximum capabilities to get the real benefit of the AI.
Right. So it sounds like expectation is, for the most part, whatever AI machine learning tools that you're going to be using on a day-to-day basis should be embedded in the tools you are bringing in-house. Like you're not looking to custom make things, right?
I would say we're not looking to custom make things that sit outside of the system.
Right. So it should be in the box, basically. You don't want to have to take things out. Something that you mentioned when we spoke last week was the idea, we were talking about AI versus automation, and how you had mentioned like AI and machine learning should not be conflated with automation. And maybe that's something we can end on as kind of a last topic, is kind of talk about where's the line? Like what do you think? Where does automation end and AI begin? Or, I guess if you want to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by we should not conflate it.
So let me give a really good example of what I would consider automation. It doesn't innately require AI for. So when we talked to Drew about some future visions with EDC and having 23 fields that we can map to automate the build of a study,
Mhm.
that is not AI, that's automation, right? So that's saying taking conceptually some data from a protocol, getting the metadata out of a protocol, mapping it to these 23 fields, and driving the build of a study. You don't require AI for that. Now you might use AI to extract that metadata out of the protocol,
Mhm.
right, into maybe a structured data set. But the actual automation of this metadata table of these fields to the build doesn't really require AI, or the vast majority of it doesn't. And so I think that sometimes we are getting pressured heavily, adopt AI, adopt AI, adopt AI. But there's some things that we get huge gains on if we would focus on leveraging this metadata content and actually just doing some, I don't want to say simple programming, but some programming to automate just those workflows. So that would be an example I would use.
Yeah, I think at least for me, the bar for AI has always been very high, right? I grew up on Terminator and The Matrix, and I think of AI as like, wow, there are agents. Now there are actually agents in our machines, right? But the idea of artificial intelligence and helping us do what we do, the bar for that is much higher, I think, relative to in the past. People would say, oh, this is AI. And in fact, it's probably just a really complex edit check, right? In terms of data management. Or it might be a derivation, or it might be a mapping from this field to this field. It's not AI. It's really good automation to make sure that we don't have to do that stuff anymore.
I think it's also differentiating like traditional versus generative AI. So, like a place where I could see us using a lot of traditional AI, which is more machine learning in nature, is in like your data review, right? In trying to drive that in more of a risk based concept. And do you actually see issues with that? I think the generative AI and using the LLMs is going to be more towards that content. So, I do think there's benefits in the documents themselves. I think that's a huge opportunity that we should be looking at. But I don't think we should be looking at in isolation of also considering just general automations to make the day-to-day life of the work that we do a lot more efficient and also reduce the variability of how individuals do it.
Excellent. So I've one last question. What would be your call to action for the industry? And it could be anything. It could be as provocative or, or not. And maybe to bring us back to the original, start of the discussion in medtech specifically, what would be a call to action specific to medtech, whether it's like informing people who are not so familiar with it to like get more educated, if it's like, hey, regulators, give us more standards, like give us more guidance, whatever it is, I would be put out to both of you. What would be your call to action for the industry for, the medtech side of the house?
You wanna go first?
I mean, mine's pretty simple. I feel like I've already covered it quite a bit in the episode. I would say when you invest and implement something, make sure people use it and really pay attention to it for the long haul for systemic adoption. And I would also be cautious and avoid pilots because I think sometimes we live in pilots entirely too long. And we need to actually really enforce the rollout systemically across the organization. I think sometimes we pilot a lot of different things, but we don't actually implement something broadly. I mean, those are relatively simple calls to action. And then I would say deliver on what you said you were going to do, right? So if you said you were going to save this amount of money or make it this much faster, then prove it at the end of that timeline and do that and pay it forward because ultimately that goes into our products that go to the patients. And that's what's important is for us to steward that well.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I help double down on that, but then also my battle cry since joining Veeva MedTech has been how can we modernize MedTech? I guess the call to action is we are on the precipice of I think something really, really important within medical device and diagnostics. Standards is one thing, maybe, hopefully. Enforcement is another thing. But then I think the realization that we are all the companies that I've had the opportunity to work with in the past and now here at Viva, they are more alike than they are different. We are reviewing and approving devices all the way from, like I said, maybe not band-aids anymore, but from band-aids all the way to the most complex tissue formation or pacemakers or other things specific to the cardiovascular system. There is a lot of power in making sure that the industry as a whole kind of comes together and says, this is how we want to do things a little bit more effectively. We saw, and I was a part of this program at my former employer during the COVID-19 pandemic. The ITAP program, I think, was able to go through, I think, millions of EUAs very rapidly because everything was standardized. In this age that we're living in now, we went through the keynote yesterday. It is more likely that we will see another pandemic in our lifetime than the previous 100 years. How are we equipped from a medical device, diagnostics, pharmaceutical standpoint to actually base that together? I think it's going to be standards, making sure that we unify our systems, and then more importantly, the companies are not always jockeying for space.
hmm Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you both for being here. I really do appreciate it, Leianne, John. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. It really helps us out. You can find previous episodes on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere that you get your podcasts from. If you'd like to reach out with any feedback or thoughts, or if you'd like to participate as a guest on the podcast, you can reach out to unblindedpod@veeva.com. For now, I'm Manny Vazquez. We'll see you next time.